started with the training of the military horse. During the great wars of the 18th century, the French army developed the concept of the three-day event. In Europe, it was called the military, and it often still is. First, there was dressage, to test the horse's obedience, response, and balance on the parade ground. Cross-country, the second phase, was intended to develop the boldness and speed of the horse during the cavalry charge. On the battlefield, the rider's life might depend on his horse's ability over obstacles. And after the battle, the cavalry would advance. Show jumping was simply to test if the horses were still fit from the day before. The British, of course, didn't waste their time with all of this. They just loved their hunting, and they reckoned a good hunter made a good war horse. Their cavalry charges were legendary. But then, in 1948, the Olympic Games came to England, and the three-day event was a disaster for the British. Next year, the 10th Duke of Beaufort, thinking ahead to the 1952 Olympic Games, started the badminton horse trials. That first year, there were only 22 starters, and 13 finished. But a new era had begun. The three-day grew in popularity. So it was something of a shock when in 1951 the Swiss came, and they took 6 of the top 10 places. The winner was Hans Schwarzenbach. It was only due to a young Scottish rider, Jane Drummond Hay, that the British saved any face at all. As usual, the foreign riders had been practicing dressage before the event. But clearly things had to change. Three-day eventing was no longer a hobby sport for the country gentleman or a pastime for cavalry officers with time on their hands. In '53, it was the European Championships of badminton. Teams from 5 other countries came to take on the British. Increasingly attracting large crowds, the three-day event was also getting popular with the royal family. Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth was keenly interested, and she came both to see the event and later on to award and present the prizes. A strong contingent from Sweden came to the European Championships, and of course there were the Swiss. But this time things went much better for the British. Led by Bertie Hill, they won the team gold medal, and Lawrence Rooke won the championships on Starlight, a horse rejected as too temperamental to be included in the team. And a new name emerged. In second place, Frank Weldon and Kilbarry, a combination which was to become the dominating force over the next few years in the sport. Two years later, the European Championships were held at Windsor by invitation of the Queen in the Great Park. And again, the Swiss were the team to beat. This time interest came not just from the royal family. Public enthusiasm for the sport was growing, and it brought television for the first time, with BBC cameras. On the cross-country section, designed by the legendary Bill Thompson, there were serious problems. Some riders still didn't realize the extent to which eventing was now a serious business and required preparation. the end of the championships, the British team just pipped the Swiss for the gold medal, and the individual title was won by Kilbarry with Frank Weldon. They'd been second at badminton the 2 previous years, but this time made no mistake. Frank, now Colonel Weldon, was the reigning European champion, but although he'd had several attempts before, he'd never actually won what people were by this time accepting as the world's preeminent equestrian competition, badminton. This was to change. From 1953, Frank Weldon and Kilbarry were in 4 European teams, winning 1 individual and 3 team gold medals. They were 3rd and won a team gold in the 1956 Olympic Games. At badminton, they were 2nd twice, and then finally they won the competition in 1956. Later, Colonel Frank was in the British Olympic team again in 1960, and in 1962 he finally finished with a 2nd at badminton. From 67 onwards he directed the event itself, and this went on for the next 21 years. Unlike at badminton, women were not allowed to ride on the international teams until 1954. And it was in that year that badminton was won by Margaret Huff, after Frank Weldon had 2 show jumps down. In 1956, Sheila Wilcox finished 2nd to Weldon, and the next year she went 1 better. Sheila was only 20 when she first rode at badminton, but she soon became a legend. In 1957, with High and Mighty, she won with a margin of 27 penalties and began to attract attention from the media. She did it again in 58 and in 59. She was unquestionably the best rider of her day, as one of her contemporaries, Michael Bullen, recalled.
She was totally brilliant. She said she could learn more in a week than anybody else would in 6 months. But she really was brilliant. And she was an education.
After this 3rd consecutive win on Airs and Graces, the gentlemen riders were beginning to wonder if they'd ever get a look in again. The female ascendancy didn't last for long. The following year, a crack team from Australia came to badminton. They'd been over before in 55, but now included Bill Roycroft and Laurie Morgan, both preparing for the Olympic Games in Rome. They were to dominate for the next 2 years. Bill was an Australian dairy farmer. His horse, Our Solo, a 15-hand stock horse, small but super fit. The Aussies took 3 of the top 4 places, having, so they said, schooled their horses on the ship's deck on the way over. Later, in Rome in the Olympic Games, Australia won the team gold medal. Laurie Morgan was the individual champion riding salad days. He'd been 2nd at badminton to Bill earlier in the year, and he was to come back the following year to win. One of a family of 6 children who all rode ponies, Mike was the first Bullen to get into eventing. Through the 1960s, he'd had increasing success, and he was on 2 Olympic teams.
As an event rider, badminton, I think, is the place to ride, and I was lucky enough to ride there quite a lot. And that and the Olympic Games, you can forget all these world championships and everything else that they keep putting in and thinking up. Badminton and the Olympics are the 2 important things. And however much they...
Mike went to the Tokyo Games in '64, but it was not a lucky competition.
But because it had rained so much, it was very sort of up and down. One minute you were on the hard, next minute you were in the deep. And we had a little bit of a problem at one of the last fences in the steeplechase where a horse disappeared into a hole and turned head over heels, and he cut his head open on the fence, and I broke my shoulder and dislocated it at the same time. But inevitably when you're wound up and it's hot and you don't really notice these things, so we got back on and off we went. And it wasn't until we got to the end of the roads and tracks that I realised that I'd actually broken my shoulder and done all this sort of damage to it.
In 1968, Jane Bullen, Mike's younger sister, was a student nurse at the Middlesex Hospital in London. She'd already had quite a career in the pony club and in showing competitions. Here seen in 1957, where she'd just won the 12-2 at the Royal Counties Show. 10 years later, she had a professional career.
Middlesex Hospital had a very good system where you did 1 week's night duty a month, and you had to just make sure you were on the right rota, so you had your 4 days off after your week's night duty, which covered the 3-day events. And so, with a bit of chatting up and trying to be on my best behaviour, that worked very well during those early years, particularly with our Nobby when I rode at Badminton. And although the one was a bit sleepy, it was probably made one quite relaxed because Nobby's dressage was pretty appalling, and I wasn't very interested in those days anyway. So that worked quite well, and later on it got easier.
8 years later at Burley, Jane came back to the top, this time with a new horse, Warrior. And they surprised everyone again.
We actually had 9 time penalties, and it was Warrior's first Burley, his second 3-day event. And I thought, oh gosh, he just isn't fast enough, he hasn't quite got the quality to do this. And we were first to go. Warrior, being the sort of horse he is, always wanted to make quite sure that he was going to be all right. He wasn't too worried about you on top, that was up to you sort of feeling. But one learnt to just sort of sit behind him a little bit, being prepared for anything, because you just had to ride him like that. I remember the coffin because Mark Phillips had a fall there and he would have won if he hadn't done that. So it was to my benefit too. I think he went in a bit boldly. It was a new coffin and it was quite deep, and you had to be quite athletic, and that of course really worked with Warrior.
2 years later, in 1978, Jane took Warrior to Badminton. She was now aged 30, but she repeated her winning performance from 10 years before when she'd won on our Nobby. She received the Whitbread Trophy from, of course, Her Majesty the Queen. At the Olympic Games in 1968, the British team won their second team gold medal. And in that team, with Jane Bullen and others, was Richard Mead. Richard was runner-up to Jane Bullen at Badminton that year. But in 1970, with the Poacher, he won the event in his own right. And in 1972, at the Munich Olympic Games, the British won their third team gold. Richard won the individual medal with Lauriston. He is still the only British rider ever to have achieved that. Richard, in fact, was on every national team from 1964 to 1982 in the Olympic and World Championships. That's nearly 20 years. And in 1982, now riding Speculator, he came back to Badminton and won again, 12 years after his first success there. He was a superb competitive horseman, an especially good team rider, and perhaps more than anyone provided the foundation for what was to become a golden age for the British team. By the early 1970s, spectators visiting Badminton had grown to around 100,000. These big three-day eventing occasions were now among the most popular sports in the country. Leading the surge of public interest were three personalities: Captain Mark Phillips, Lucinda Pryor-Palmer, and Her Royal Highness the Princess Anne. In 1971, Mark Phillips became the new star when he rode Great Ovation to their first badminton win. It was to be the first of several successes for this pair. And later in 1971, Princess Anne took doublet, owned by the Queen, to Burley for the European Championships. She wasn't included in the British team. Led by Richard Meade, that team won the gold medal. But riding as an individual, Princess Anne proved to be in a class of her own. Across country was near faultless. She'd been in the lead after the dressage. But when she was out on the course, Debbie West and Baccarat had put out an outstanding performance. The Princess needed a fast, clear round. And indeed, at the end of the cross-country, Doublet retained his lead. But now he had 3 fences in hand over Baccarat for the show jumping the next day. Never been anything less than a nerve-wracking occasion to jump for a European Championship. Must be even more difficult when your mother owns your horse and she's the Queen of England. Certainly the Burley crowd absolutely thrilled to see their princess doing so well. And indeed it proved that even somebody with a good lead, it could still be exciting right to the end. Down the last line, and Doublet was pretty strong. In 1972, Mark Phillips brought Great Ovation back to badminton to defend his title. He was up against pretty tough opposition that year, and everybody had their sights set on the Olympic Games. Leading after the dressage, on cross-country day, Mark had just 7 points in hand over Richard Meade and 7.5 over Mary Gordon-Watson and Cornishman. The competition was on a knife edge throughout. Time penalties on the steeplechase had left Mark only half a point ahead of Richard by the time they started the cross-country. On that tough test, nobody made the time. The result was that at the end of cross-country day, Richard had a half-point advantage over Mark. These two were out on their own, 30 points ahead of Bridget Parker in third. But in fourth place, another new face on her first ride at badminton, Lucinda Pryor-Palmer. Just 18 years old.
And I vaguely, I suppose he would have been a girlfriend of Mark Phillips's. And he said he'd walk the course with me at badminton in 72. And I thought, that's wonderful. He's won it, goodness knows how many times. You know, I shall be all right if he walks it with me. And Mark, he never says a lot, does he? And he said very little going round that course. I mean, nowadays you'd walk it and you'd get a lot more off him. And he just kept every face, just said, kick on. And I thought, okay, and waited for the sort of words of wisdom to come before the quarry, and he just said, kick on. All I had in my mind was kick on, and that was exactly the right thing for somebody into their first badminton. You freeze with terror as you go out of that box, and it was just, those words just kept coming back through me.
The lake at Badminton is one of the world's best-known challenges.
Into the lake and impact, marking off.
In 1973, Mark Phillips bounced off the Queen's horse Columbus.
Into the lake and impact, marking off.
He wasn't the only one to be caught out that year. It was a particularly difficult course, and only 8 riders got round without jumping penalties. Klaus Wagner, some way behind Mark Phillips, was not one of them. And this opened up an opportunity for the 19-year-old Lucinda, here again with B Fair. Lying 4th after the dressage on 42 penalties, she was only 6 points behind Mark's double winner, Great Ovation. And many of the other competitors had already been eliminated. She could get round clear and show jump clear. Perhaps she could win. This competition became one of getting round. And if you couldn't do it in the ordinary way, you could always use your imagination, like Rachel Bayliss at the Stockholm fence. Over, under or through, it's all perfectly legal. Princess Anne, more used to media attention, didn't try anything so unconventional with the great goodwill. She showed just how Colonel Frank had intended the fence to be jumped. Good luck one year, bad luck the next. In 1974, Lucinda and B Fair at the Crooked S. Mark Phillips, on the other hand, had a complete change of luck with Columbus. This time he had no problems at the lake, nor indeed anywhere else. He was 3rd after the dressage and moved up when Princess Anne, who'd led with doublet, had to withdraw after a fall on the steeplechase. Columbus was outstanding. He went on to lead the World Championships at Burghley, as sadly was lame and couldn't show jump to win Mark a world title. But at Badminton, he won, and it was Mark's 3rd victory. At Badminton, the 10 years from 1970 to 1980 were dominated by Mark Phillips and Lucinda Pryor-Palmer. He took the Whitbread Trophy 4 times. Lucinda had an astonishing 6 wins, including 2 in the 80s, an achievement never matched by any other rider. And what's more, she did it on 6 different horses.
But they were an extraordinary array of horses and different, totally different, which was fascinating. So I had to relearn to ride, really, every single time I got on one and start all over again to learn. It was only really in about 1990 when this flow of talented horses stopped. It was only then I realised how good they were when I started riding less good ones. And I think, you know, anybody's career, they'll say the same. They have a period of really good horses. I had a period of really good horses, about 15 years. And then when it wasn't so good, I started to think, you know, golly, They were even better than I realised.
In 1977, Colonel Frank introduced for the first time a bounce into the lake.
I remember being first to go the year they had a bounce into water, never been seen or jumped before anywhere, and I had absolutely no idea if it was even possible. And I remember galloping up towards the lake and all these people just waiting, and this terrific silence as I entered the area where the people were, and he just looked at this fence and just galloped in his little pitter-patter into it, slightly down the hill, over the first one, put in a tiny little stride, over the second one, plopped into the lake, and away he went. And I think Frank Weldon had it at 15 or 16 feet, and in those days that was a normal bounce distance, but as soon as you have a drop into water, the next day I think it came back to 13 or 12 feet. But Claire, bless his heart, with his inimitable little stride, just that's okay, popped in a little stride, just a bit short. And it was the most incredible feeling, riding into a fence. I remember saying to myself, I don't even know if this fence is possible.
Year after year, the lake continued, however, to claim its victims. Colin Wares with Island Monarch. He found the drop too much. And on another occasion, Mark Phillips gave eventing historians a truly unforgettable story. Riding Brazil, he came unstuck at the tree in the middle. It was total immersion. But Mark, being a sensible chap, did the obvious thing. For the Montreal Olympic Games in 1976, the British were a strong prospect. Apart from Lucinda, they had Richard Meade, Princess Anne, and Hugh Thomas. The British team were hoping for a third consecutive gold medal. Sadly for them, it all went wrong. Although Richard and Lucinda finished cross-country in 4th and 5th places, Princess Anne and Hugh Thomas both had falls. And be fair, Lucinda's horse had an injury.
And as he came round the corner to the finish of the Olympic Games, suddenly he went completely lame behind and he'd slipped the Achilles tendon off his hock. Just one of those things, and he would have been in line for a silver medal himself, if not more, but that was obviously completely that, with no Achilles tendon left on his hog.
As the 70s moved on towards the 1980s, Lucinda's achievements mounted. She'd already won 2 European gold medals at Le Moulin in '75 and at Burghley in 1977. She won badminton for a 4th time in 1979 with Killaire. And after a 3-year gap, during which she picked up a World Championship gold in 1982, she came back to badminton in '83 with Regal Realm, and she won it again. Her 6th badminton win in '84 was with Beagle Bay, her riding career by this time surpassing anything done before at this level. 6 badminton wins, 2 European Championships, and a World Championship. But Lucinda never won an Olympic individual medal. For some 20 years, Mark Todd dominated 3-day eventing at international level in just about every country where the best riders went to compete. He may not have won every time, but for most of the time he was the man to beat. So how did it all start?
Well, I first sort of got interested when I was at Pony Club. We had quite a strong eventing team within the Pony Club, and in those days in New Zealand there wasn't a lot of it except in the Pony Club. And then as I sort of got a bit older, I went into show jumping during the summer months, and then did eventing in the winter, and I sort of enjoyed doing everything really.
And then you turned up in this country in 1980-ish, won badminton. How did the Brits treat you? I mean, what was it like?
Well, I'd had a little bit of a sort of introduction because I'd been in 1978. I went to the World Championships in Kentucky, and then spent my first year in England in 1979. And as you say, came back in '80 and won badminton. And I think it was as much a shock as to everybody else as it was to myself. And but no, I was very well accepted, and sort of after that, it sort of went on.
In 1980, Mark brought Southern Comfort, a New Zealand-bred horse, to badminton. The course was exceptionally difficult.
Down into the road, up, and he slips, and he can't possibly...
Well, I'd walked the course the year before in '79, and you know, thought it was jumpable, and went there in '80, and it was a very big year actually. And I think I was, from memory, I was about sort of middle of the field to go. And there'd been very few to get round even. And Sally O'Connor was actually there sort of helping and advising a bit at that time. And I remember afterwards she said she was too frightened to say what had been going on because there'd been so many disasters. I had one anxious moment at the footbridge where he just about landed in the ditch on the landing side and went down on his nose and skidded along, but he picked himself up and carried on, and I had a great ride. I was very confident in the horse. He was a very good jumper. So I just went out there and rode the course how I'd walked it and how I thought it should be ridden, and the horse was amazing.
Mark's win in 1980 started probably the most impressive career anyone has had in the sport of eventing. In 1984, he brought a new horse, Charisma, over from New Zealand.
Well, he was just a very special little horse. He was a tremendous all-rounder. He had a great personality. He was a very, very good mover, wonderful temperament, very bold and fast cross-country horse. He was only about 15.3, a real little character.
Charisma, in fact, never did win badminton, though that year they were second to Lucinda Green and Beagle Bay, and later on in '84 at the Los Angeles Olympic Games, they won the gold medal. In 1985, at badminton, the show jumping was to prove a real cliffhanger. The relative newcomer, Ginny Holgate, was in the ring on Priceless. She'd already made sure of fourth place with her other horse, Nightcap. But there were only 4 points between the top three. She came to the end of her round with Priceless, and no one could afford a single fence down. The first of very, very many clear rounds at badminton for Ginny. Torrance Watkins from America. She was the individual Olympic silver medalist. She led the dressage, not much in front of Mark Todd, just a couple of points. And in fact, he'd overtaken her on cross-country day. The last treble tells its own story. Even at this sort of level, the very best horses and riders can make the most appalling mistakes. For Mark Todd, over the years, the situation was to be quite familiar. all dependent on the last round in the show jumping. Sometimes it was to his advantage, sometimes it wasn't. Charisma was certainly hot favourite as the Olympic champion. But it wasn't to be. The very last fence took him to second again by just 1 mark. And Ginny Holgate won her first badminton on Priceless. She was third as well with Nightcap.
I could be in no better place. You're simply the best. You're better than all the rest. You're better than anyone.
Ginny Holgate, later Ginny Lang and indeed Ginny Elliott, was rapidly becoming the star of the international eventing scene. She'd already won Burghley in '83. In 1984, she won the bronze medal at the Los Angeles Olympic Games with Priceless. And in the same year, she brought Nightcap, her supposed second string, to Burghley. But she wasn't that confident about his chances.
Well, he did, for him, not a good dressage test. He was overexcited, and I remember walking down to the lorry saying to my mother, you know, it's really sad for Nightcap because he's got a lot of talent, but he's never going to win a 3-day event because he hasn't got the temperament. Anyway, the next day, the course was causing quite a lot of trouble, and I was about number 38 to go, I think, and I think I'm right in saying that I only had 1 clear run at that point. So I have to say I was feeling pretty sick when I set off. And he really came into his own. He made a very bad mistake at the end of the course. There was a bounce of brushes, and he tried to put a stride in, and we got away with it. You know, you have to have a bit of luck here and there. But it was great for him because I always felt he had a talent, and to actually win a 3-day, especially at Burghley, was pretty exciting.
Ginny's success was partly due to her huge natural talent, but another factor was the meticulous preparation of her horses.
Now then, I should start concentrating if I were you.
Back up at home from Mother Heather and her trainer Dot Willis provided a string of top quality rides, well schooled, confident and really ready to go.
Well, I love teaching particularly young horses and young people because there's always a new crop coming along. You're always very excited and very expectant that they're going to do well. And I've been lucky enough to be associated with horses at all levels. And I feel that the starting of training with young horses is very important. And I feel that if you give them a good grounding, it's with them for the rest of their lives. And one gets a tremendous amount of satisfaction from that.
So with all this work and youngsters coming and going right up to advanced level, I mean, what does it feel like when you're at badminton and you realise that the horse has just won it, that you've trained?
Nothing on earth of excitement. Very, very exciting, I must say, very elated, very, very happy that the team effort has got it right.
After Priceless and Nightcap came others, and amongst them a horse that became one of the very great characters of the sport in the 80s and 90s, Murphy himself.
Well, Murphy, as people who've watched him in the past with myself and Ian, had his own way of doing things. And he was very inexperienced. He was only a 7-year-old when he went to Burghley. Because he was very brave and he'd won a couple of 3-day events beforehand, I felt he was ready to go. And he went beautifully, and about 3/4 of the way around the course, he rather took control. And I have to say Murphy won Burghley for himself because he was going faster than I'd like to go. We got inside the time. That was more sort of, I think, luck than judgment, probably on his part. But he was a very special horse, huge horse, very, very difficult to ride. But I was very chuffed that he managed to win Burghley that year.
But Ginny had more trouble riding Murphy. So she swapped him with Ian Stark's Griffin.
I was very unhappy about parting with him. I felt that I could find a way to manage him, but I was given, especially when he dumped me at Badminton at the bottom of the ski jump, I was given a bit of pressure from home, so I sort of thought, oh, fair enough. And Ian is a wonderful chap and a great rider, and he got on with him really well, so at the end of the day it worked out all right.
Ian Stark first went to Badminton in 1984 with Sawati and Oxford Blue, on which he was third. Oxford Blue, in fact, was part of the silver medal team in Los Angeles later on that same year. Two years later at Burghley, he had another horse, Glen Burnie, first of several grey horses, which gave Ian a lot of successes, a lot of anxious moments, and one or two painful memories. Glen Burnie was a tremendous performer across country. That year at Burghley, when he was fourth, he was 26 seconds inside the optimum time.
The greys with attitude. Probably some people would say that they had attitude, so had I, so maybe we were made for each other. But when I had Sawati and Oxford Blue, I had each horse had a snaffle bit that they did all three phases in. Then I got the grey boys, and I had to do a lot of purchasing of new bits and ironmongery to try and control them. And it's quite nice now because I've gone back to the sort of easier, younger horses or not so strong horses. I think I've got most of my bits out on loan to a lot of different riders here at Burghley. The greys were a bit of a mixed blessing and incredibly talented. I mean, Glen Burnie was the fastest thing I think I've ever ridden cross country, and Murphy certainly was probably the scopiest I've ever ridden. But I wouldn't like to go back to them now. I think they were horses for a young person to ride. They were a bit on the edge all the time, and it took me about a year after I retired them to learn how to ride normal horses again, because I tended to get on thinking, well, this is going to be a strong horse, and so I would immediately become defensive and aggressive, thinking of the grey boys. So I had to learn to sort of chill a bit and ride normally again.
In 1988, Ian's two Badminton rides were Sawati and Glen Burnie, and for the first time in the history of the event, he scored a remarkable 1-2, first and second. Early on, he went into the lead on Glen Burnie, just ahead of Ginny Lang with Master Craftsman.
I mean, I had fantastic rides cross country on Sawati and Glen Burnie, and I knew I was in the lead before I went out on Sawati. Glen Burnie was already in the lead. In fact, Sawati took me around my first Badminton, and I made a lot of mistakes, and he bailed me out and picked himself up, and so he taught me a hell of a lot. I mean, he was just an out-and-out trier, an out-and-out winner. His last year eventing, for example, in '88, he won every one-day event, including the final trial and Badminton, and then he went to Seoul for the Olympics and was second. So, you know, that was him all over. He just tried every time. The thing I remember the most was that I was so busy enjoying the Saturday that on the Sunday morning I forgot to walk the show jumping course. So I got up there, it was too late, and so my major panic was I was going to go wrong in the show jumping. But I mean, I had fantastic rides cross country on Sawati and Glen Burnie, and I knew I was in the lead before I went out on Sawati. Glen Burnie was already in the lead, and then again when I finished the show jumping on Glen Burnie, before I even went in on Wati, I knew I'd won it. So that was quite a nice feeling to go in leading position, but knowing I'd already won it, even if I fell off at Wati. So it doesn't happen too often. And walking the course, I said, oh, I think Murphy might take a stride out here, and everybody just laughed. It was just him, you know. I learned very, very early on when I took over the ride from Ginny and Elliot, and I realised from then, at an early stage, that you know, I was the passenger here and he was in control. So all I could do was present him at the fence in what I thought was the right speed and rhythm and everything. And then I had to just say, well, it's over to you, mate. And I had to try and go with him. And so you never quite knew if you thought he was going to bounce a one stride or take a stride out of a combination. When I was ready for it, he didn't do it. And when I wasn't ready for it, he always pulled me through the air at the buckle end, you know, sort of gasping for breath. I knew, I had huge faith in him though. I knew if I didn't interfere, he wasn't going to lie down on me, so I just had to learn to be brave enough to go with it.
The Barcelona Olympic Games were not a British triumph, but Punchestown, for the Europeans, was a very different story.
I remember before Punchestown, we were given a lot of lectures on how to eat to develop our stamina. And the riders I'm talking about, not the horses. And so I was stuffing myself the night before cross-country with all this wretched pasta. Got onto the cross-country course, got to about fence 7 or 8, threw my whip away because I needed both hands on the rein. And towards the end of the course, he'd been fighting so much, I was down on the clock, so I released him. And I thought I'd never going to get him back for the last few fences because he looked as though he was sprinting at Ascot, not getting to the end of a 4.5 mile cross-country course. And he felt a bit like that. And I got off at the end completely and absolutely exhausted and said, that's it, I'm going back to steak after this. So I've never been a great fan of pasta since.
In 1989 at Burghley, there was to be another European Championship. And in the same year, badminton was 40 years old. After 21 years at the helm, Colonel Frank Weldon had retired. Badminton Village Hall was the setting every year for a riders' briefing, where old hands and newcomers were told of the local rules. As always, it was introduced by the host, the Duke of Beaufort.
And you'll all have a good week. As you know, we've got a new director here who, as Colonel Weldon said to me the other day, I don't think he's altogether a fool. So coming from him, this is euphoric praise.
Badminton that year produced one of its closest battles between Ginny Leng, with her new horse Master Craftsman, and Mark Todd, who this time was riding the Irishman, a horse normally ridden by Rodney Powell. Ginny was second after the dressage, but by the end of her cross-country round, she was to go into the lead. Something of a surprise for the rider.
That was dear old Crafty, Master Craftsman, who, as a 6-year-old, I kept saying to my mother, you know, this horse he's just not, hasn't got it. He's not athletic, he's very long, he's a real thoroughbred, and I don't think he'll ever be athletic enough to do the job. He proved me wrong, slowly but surely.
Ginny had 7 time penalties. And following on behind was Mark Todd. The Irishman was a very fast horse. Mark was the last to go and knew exactly what he had to do. Practically no one was making the time, except of course Rian Stark and Glen Burnie. But if Mark could go clear, and inside the time, then he could just take the lead. The optimum time for the course was exactly 12 minutes.
Come to the finish. In fact, complete in a time of 11 minutes 56 seconds.
It was another astonishing performance from the maestro on a horse he'd never ridden before. But his lead was only 0.4 of a penalty. And of course the show jumping was still to come. Ginny Leng jumped a clear round. She's certain of at least second place. Mark Todd couldn't even afford a time penalty. He'd less than half a point in hand. So that fence put him down to third place. Ginny won her second badminton. Come the autumn, it was to Burley for the European Championships, for the 5th time in 20-odd years. Apart from Ginny, Ian Stark, Rodney Powell and Lorna Clark were in the British team. Ginny had Master Craftsman. Quite apart from his badminton win earlier in the spring, Crafty had won the Olympic bronze medal in Seoul the year before, where Ian Stark had won the silver. And this time, Ian rode Glen Burnie, not his Olympic horse, Sawati. This was the first year Burley's cross-country course had been designed by Mark Phillips. It looked a very serious proposition. Apart from a tricky coffin, he'd made changes to the trout hatchery, now entered over a wall. But the fence nobody wanted to take on straight was the snake in the arena. Nobody, that is, except Ian Stark. The rumour was that Ian had had a bet with Mark Phillips that it could be done, and as last to go for the team, he could afford it. Matthias Bowman from Germany with Shamrock, another Olympic gold medalist, had a difficult time at the trout hatchery and was pretty lucky, taking the direct route through the house. While Jane Selwell, the previous Burley winner with King's Jester, had another lucky escape on the way out. Pretty good demonstration of a fine old-fashioned English hunting seat. Ginny with Master Craftsman was on her very best form. The coffin was a difficult fence and a clever one. You either risked a run out straight through or normally had to take a long route round to get at the last part. But Ginny did neither. She was the only rider to find a neat, safe way through. Over the side by the white flag, jumps the ditch, and in 3 strides manages the arm of the arrowhead. The only one to do it, and saved a lot of time. Show jumping, however, nearly threw everything away. 2 clear fences in hand and riding a careful jumper, Ginny looked certain to win her 3rd European gold medal. But then, everything seemed to go horribly wrong.
When I landed, I'd overdone my turn, and then I was at the point of sort of limbo. Which way was I going to go to get to the gate? So I actually thought the best thing to do is just stop and don't panic. Try not to panic, and maybe go find another route to it. It was a very unfortunate moment. Thank God it worked out all right.
Frank Weldon had trouble with Sheila Wilcox in the 50s, and Mark Phillips with Lucinda Pryor-Palmer, Lucinda Green in the 70s. By the late 80s and early 90s, everybody was having trouble with the New Zealanders. An army of Kiwis had followed Mark Todd and come to Britain, and among them, Blythe Tate. In 1990, he took Messiah to the World Equestrian Games in Stockholm and became the new world champion, though not without some alarms. Mark Todd has never won the World Championships, but every year he continued to win major competitions all over Europe, such as this one at Buccolo.
Clear the finish for number 1, Fido to Marcos, New Zealand.
Andrew Nicholson came over to England in the early 80s. He was regularly the most prolific points winner in the country, and he won the second running of the new 3-day event at Blenheim.
Andrew Nicholson and Parkgrove.
His biggest individual win was Burley in 1995.
Fence number 5.
The New Zealanders seemed almost unbeatable, and they'd been going from strength to strength. So the question really was, what sort of secret ingredient do they have that puts them ahead of all the rest?
I know from my pony club days and whatnot, my parents would not let us have a saddle until we could ride very safely bareback, and I mean being able to gallop around the field to chasing the cows and whatnot bareback with a head collar. And then when we got the saddle, we weren't allowed proper stirrups until we could ride properly in the saddle. And I think an awful lot of it comes down to that. I know when I was at Pony Club, I always could do better in the bareback rider over jumps than I could in the normal rider over jumps with the saddle.
Toddy won Burley with Face the Music in 1990, and again in 1991, this time with Welton Greylag. He triumphed there yet again at the European Open in 1997, a World Championship in all but name, and he finished off the decade by being first and third in 1999. If you can't have the fun of riding your horse yourself, the next best thing is to get Mark Todd to sit on it.
Sort of being trailblazer at badminton on a horse that you didn't know was slightly unnerving, and in fact on the steeplechase we had a bit of a disagreement at the first fence on there, and he completely demolished it. But then after that it sort of woke both of us up, and on the cross country I had again another very good ride round badminton. Very different to a lot of the horses I ride, and he is very one-paced, and I was conscious of the fact that if I wanted to get inside the time, I just had to keep going and not sort of set him up for the fences, which the girls had always done, and he actually gave you the feeling that he needed to be set up, but I sort of had to trust the fact that he was a very good jumper, and we just kept up the same rhythm all the way round, and he just kept jumping from fence to fence, and it really was a wonderful ride. And I couldn't believe it when we sort of 2 or 3 fences from home and he was still there with a chance of getting the time, and I just gave him a bit of a kick, and he just went that little bit quicker over the last few fences and got home inside the time, so it was a tremendous thrill.
Despite the New Zealand domination, some of the younger riders were not in the least overawed. Outstanding among them, Pippa Nolan, later Pippa Funnell. She became one of the most successful riders of all at the 3-star events, especially Blenheim, which she won twice in 93 and in 95. In 1993, she faced serious opposition from Ginny Leng with Welton Romance. There was nothing in it after the dressage. And on the cross-country, they both had to go fast and clear. But Ginny would always be a hard act to beat.
Bounces through the middle elements of the second.
Pippa held on to that lead, and last to go in the show jumping, with only a tiny lead over one of the best in the world, the tension was palpable. Nothing less than a clear round would do. 2 years later, Pippa was back with the little coloured horse Bits and Pieces. This time it wasn't a question of tight scoring. She was in a class of her own on the cross-country and made the bounce into the river look like a steeplechase fence. This was attacking cross-country riding at its very best. Mary Thompson, now of course Mary King, had been pushing at the top since the mid-80s. She'd had a string of good horses, and in 1987 she took one of the best, King Boris, to Burley.
Starting with Starbird, number 104. They start with a score of 48.8.
Boris was 8th. He had some time penalties across country, and that led people to assume that he wasn't fast enough. 3 years later, 1990, she was back with King Cuthbert, an older horse, but he'd been first and second at Bramham in recent years. Burley in 90 was in fact to be his last event. There were disagreements about the length of the cross-country course, and at the very last moment, the time was arbitrarily reduced. So nobody made the time. Mary had the lead over Mark Todd, but just 2 points ahead, less than a show jumping fence down. And as so often, the last fence proved final. But of course there are those who said she would have won if the cross-country time hadn't been changed. But Mary was back, a few weeks later, this time at Blenheim. Now she had a young horse, King William. He proved to be such an effortless jumper across the country, and it wasn't long before he caught the eye of the selectors. In 91 for Punchestown, King William was selected. He'd already won the British National Championships at Gackham, Mary's second time winning there, and now it was the Europeans. With Karen Dixon, Ian Stark and Richard Walker, it was the team gold medal for Mary Thompson. By now, King William was becoming something of a character in the sport, rather like Murphy himself. He was as good as Murphy across country, but he seemed less opinionated. And the next year, King William went to Badminton. His dressage was right at the top of his form. He went into an early lead, ahead of the very experienced David O'Connor from the United States. Cross-country day in 92 was exceptionally wet after several dry years. Over 50 horses had penalties on the cross-country course, not least the very experienced Jane Holderness-Rodham on a new ride, Ballin Green. Going late in the day, King William cruised round a course which had seemed nearly impossible to many. Over that very difficult course, King William hardly put a foot wrong. The opposition was very tough. Not least, Ginny Lane had master craftsmen here, and at that point they were arguably the combination with the best form in the world. King William made no mistakes. Mary took the badminton trophy from new sponsors Mitsubishi for the first, and so far, only time in her life. Later in '92, King William was selected for the British team for the Olympic Games, this year in Barcelona. By the show jumping phase, Mary and William were fifth. Then came the problem that William showed, and it was to dog Mary at the big three-day events for years to come. The excitement of jumping in a big arena totally put him off his stride. In the end, King William had 5 fences down, dropping to 9th place. The individual and team gold medals were taken by the Australians and Matt Ryan. Karen Straker has had a tremendous career in the sport. She first came to prominence with the European Junior title in 1982, riding Running Bear. And the following year, here at Burghley, the same combination took the individual silver medal in the Young Rider European Championship, and yet another team gold medal for the British squad. By 1988, she'd ridden in the Olympic Games at Seoul with a team silver medal, and in the Olympic Games of Barcelona in '92, where she'd finished 6th, by far the best of the British riders. Here at Punchestown in '91, as Get Smart, she was to finish 3rd to take the individual bronze and another team gold medal. In 1994, now Karen Dixon, she won the Open Championships at Gatwick. And then at Burghley, with 2 Smart, she was to go into 2nd place on the cross-country behind William Fox Pitt and Charker. Sadly, a pole-down show jumping put her 3rd. The year William won, and Mary Thompson was 2nd. But that year, Karen was also to win the individual bronze medal at no less than the World Games in The Hague. This proved an absolute triumph for the all-girl British team. Karen, Mary King, Charlotte Bathe and Tina Gifford romped home with the gold medal. In 1993, the European Championships went for the first time to Axelsfang in Bavaria, southern Germany. The British, who'd won the European title 13 times in the 40 previous years, fielded a very strong team. Ginny Lane, William Fox Pitt, Nick Burton and Christina Gifford. Tina Gifford was another rider who'd been knocking at the door for some years. Another one with tremendous experience from the teams of juniors and young riders during the late 80s. She'd been round badminton and Burghley and was rarely out of the frame wherever she competed. This time at Axelsfang, she had to do her dressage in the rain, and it was seriously wet. With Song and Dance Man, Tina finished the dressage in 21st place. Not something to be all that excited about. But although 21st, She was only 10 marks behind Ginny Leng, who took the lead, and she was right up with most of the riders from the other big European teams, many of whom were thought to be much better at dressage. When it came to the cross-country, ground conditions were heavy. The time was critical, and nobody had any chance of making it.
Nummer 42 an 35, 36, fehlerfrei.
Tina Gifford am Hindernis 11 der Kombination. Tina approaches 11. Coming back to a hammering canter.
Ginny had an amazing refusal in the steeplechase.
At 11.
And by the end of the day, Tina, after a terrific round, was in second place, by less than 4 marks behind Jean-Loup Bigou's very fast horse, Twist La Beige, from France. There had been only 2 clear rounds among the top 20 as Tina started. With 1 fence down, she stayed in second place and won the European silver medal. The eventual gold medalist, Jean-Loup Bigot, was very lucky. On his round, he rattled several fences and took the title by the narrowest of margins. He was to be a fixture in the French team for many years to come. Whatever else had happened at the event, there was no doubt that a new star had arrived. Tina Gifford was at the top of the tree.
And the jester sung for the king and queen, and a coat he borrowed from James Dean, and a voice that came from you and me.
Another British rider with a great background in juniors and young riders was William Fox-Pitt. Between 1985 and 1990, William won 4 team gold medals in the European Championships at these levels with his great partner Steadfast. In '94, he took over Judy Herbert's former ride, Charker, and they went to Burley. Charker had been at Burley before with Australian Greg Watson back in '91, and in fact they were second in that year to Mark Todd.
With him, 'cause I saw you dancing in the gym. You both kicked off your shoes. Man, you think it doesn't ring the blues. I was alone, a teenage rock and roll with a incarnation and a pickup truck. But I knew I was out of love today.
This time, Mark had Bertie Blunt, an outstanding horse, and he, as well as Mary Thompson and Karen Dixon, were all within a show jump of William, who led the dressage on Charker. Even after Mark Todd had been eliminated on the roads and tracks, and that caused a lot of talking in the lorry park, William could afford no jumping or time faults throughout the competition. He had, in fact, a copybook ride. William finished the cross-country with just over a fence in hand from Mary, and with 1 show jump down, he kept his lead to the end, albeit by the very slender margin of 1.5 marks.
Practiced in the park.
Well, good luck at Burley one year, but not so good luck at badminton the following. It looked as though William and Charker were going to achieve the remarkable double, winning both badminton and Burley within 12 months. It had been done before, by Mark Phillips, Anneli Drummond-Hay years ago, Lucinda Green, and by Ginny Leng twice, but it was a pretty unusual achievement. Charker's round was just about foot perfect, and William that day showed that he was every bit as good as the best in the world. He was up against Mark Todd, Matt Ryan, Bruce Davidson.
Just a few moments. Down to see, nothing to make dropping the first one. With a pink carnation and a pickup truck, but I knew I was out of love.
Number 88, Charker, ridden by William Fox Pitt.
But the most crushing luck came the Sunday morning trotter. At that very last hurdle, before the show jumping, Charker failed the horse inspection. It's not usual for the leader to fail, but he wasn't quite right and was eliminated. Bruce Davidson of the United States finally broke his duck at badminton that year.
I'm afraid that Charker has not passed.
Bruce Davidson had won Olympic medals and 2 world championships in a 25-year career. One of those, in fact, was at Burley in 1974. He'd had a string of successes in countries all over the world, but he'd never won badminton. He'd been 4th, 3rd, and in 1982, 2nd. But somehow, first place had always eluded him. In 1995, at last, Bruce won what had now become the Mitsubishi Motors Trophy.
Just a few moments. Nothing to make dropping the first one and general.
This really marked the beginning of a resurgence in the fortunes of American riders. For in 3rd place that same year was Karen O'Connor. And it was Karen's husband David who took the trophy himself 2 years later. In '96, he'd been 3rd behind Mark Todd and Vaughan Jeffries, 2 New Zealanders. But in '97, he made sure of victory for himself, ahead of Mary King and William Fox Pitt. Many people thought it a pity that Mark Phillips, who was by now the trainer of the American team, had not been snapped up by the British.
You're simply the best. You're better than all the rest. You're better than everyone. Anyone out there.
As the end of the millennium approached, the New Zealanders stayed very much on top. Blythe Tate, having won the individual Olympic gold medal in 1996 in Atlanta, went on to lead the New Zealanders to the team gold and won the individual himself at the World Games in Protoni 2 years later. He became the only rider to hold both medals, the Olympic and World Championship golds. For none of the other world champions had ever achieved that elusive Olympic title. Blythe also had the distinction that year of being only the second person to be first and second at Burgh. But for the British, now somewhat in the doldrums, things began to brighten up a little as the 1990s drew to a close. And in 1998, Chris Bartle brought word perfect to badminton and won it. It had been 5 years since a British rider last achieved this, Ginny Leng back in '93. Chris had taken up eventing after a very successful career as a dressage rider, and he now proved he could ride across country with the very best in the world. He pushed Mark Todd down into yet another second place here, and Bruce Davidson was third. Incidentally, the oldest trio to be first, second and third in the history of badminton. And as the millennium came to an end in 1999, Ian Stark ended a long period in the wilderness by taking the badminton trophy.
Davy was the 8-year-old, hadn't been there before. It was his first 4-star. And, you know, I'd had great hopes for Arakai and that JB would come along quietly in the background. And as it worked out for the ground conditions, JB was first to go and completely and absolutely excelled. And you're quite right, he doesn't pull my arms out. And he's a nice person to ride in all 3 phases because he's usually fairly reliable in the dressage. And he can show jump well. So it's probably a nice, slightly more gentle ride for my old age. But he was fantastic at badminton. I mean, 11 years since I'd won badminton, so it was a long time coming. And I think as dear old Mark Phillips said in the Horse and Hound, thought I was past it. Well, thank goodness I'm not, I hope.
In the 11 years since his first and second placings in 1998, Ian had led before the show jumping twice. Now, with Lady Hartington's JB, he had a horse in which he had confidence in all 3 phases. Also at badminton in the last year of the millennium, Pippa Funnell produced a fine round with the relatively green Supreme Rock. His cross-country impressed everybody, even after a rather unlucky stop at the lake. Inexperienced, but very, very difficult conditions. And later that year, the selector's faith in the horse was justified when Pippa took him to Le Moulin for the European Championships. At the last major event of the millennium, Pippa led the British team to a team gold medal, and she herself became the new European champion.
I mean, he really was. It wasn't as though it was a bit of a, lucky round, because he was jumping probably the best he's jumped and really coped well. And I finished, and it was a lovely feeling because I actually felt that the horse had enjoyed the ride round, so which is a big bonus.